Hey everyone, welcome to the Council of Trent podcast. I'm your host, Catholic Answers apologist and speaker, Trent Horn. Obviously, the biggest thing in the news right now is the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And obviously, there's a lot to talk about there. But one thing I wanted to focus on today was an article that was published at Catholic Answers magazine online, written by my friend and colleague, Michael Lofton, on the spiritual war in Ukraine. That there's a lot of, geopolitical, historical elements involved in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And one of the elements of the conflict is religious, specifically dealing with the Eastern Orthodox churches there in Ukraine, in Russia. So we're going to be talking all of that with someone who knows a lot about that. He is Mr. Michael Lofton, the host of Reason and Theology. He is here with us today to talk about the spiritual war in Ukraine and why that matters. So, Michael, welcome back to the show.
Hey, Trent. Thanks for having me back on.
Absolutely. So let's jump into it. Your article is about the problem of schism in the Eastern Orthodox churches. Now, it's important for people to understand that when we say Eastern Orthodoxy, it's not one unified thing like Catholicism. You have Russian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, Armenian Orthodox, all of these different Orthodox churches under different metropolitans and patriarchs. And so you talk about schism, and I think that can be hard for us to wrap our heads around in Eastern Orthodoxy, because when we think of schism, we think of refusing to submit to the Pope and to the bishops in union with the Pope. But how can people make a charge of schism among the different Eastern Orthodox churches?
Yeah, that's what's really complex here because, as you note, in Catholicism, we have an objective way to define schism. And you can see that in the Catechism of the Catholic Church or the Code of Canon Law, which effectively notes what you just said. And that is, it's the role of the papacy. You effectively have bishops that are in communion with Pope, and if you are not in communion with one of those bishops who is in communion with the Pope, then you're effectively in schism. So it really centers around that objective point of unity, namely the papacy. Whereas in Eastern Orthodoxy, that's not necessarily the case. I mean, clearly they are no longer in communion with the Pope. So to determine whether someone is in schism, it's a little bit more challenging. You'll see definitions thrown out like, well, somebody who dissents from lawful authority is in schism, but it kind of begs the question, how do you actually know that this person is lawfully in authority? Or what makes it even more complex, perhaps you have a bishop who is lawful authority, if you will, but then they begin to pray with schismatics or others who are excommunicated. And there are some canons in Orthodoxy that seem to suggest, or at least some might interpret as meaning, well, if you pray with those people, you're excommunicated yourself. And so now you're in schism. And that's kind of at the heart of the dispute right now in Eastern Orthodoxy, where you have the Patriarch of Moscow effectively saying that Constantinople, the Patriarch of Constantinople, and also the Patriarch of Alexandria, among some other clergymen, are in schism because they have celebrated the Eucharist with individuals that they believe are schismatic and, in fact, don't even have valid consecrations, in the opinion of Moscow. So they're going to say, you guys are in schism, whereas Constantinople and Alexandria would say, no, these people are legitimate individuals that we celebrated the Eucharist with, and therefore we're not excommunicated, we're not schismatic. And in fact, you're separating yourself from the unity of the Orthodox Church because now you're breaking communion with us. So it becomes very complicated to now determine, okay, well, who's actually in schism from whom?
And so that's why, especially in Catholicism, we see that importance of, like, if I could visualize it for people, it's like the Pope is like the hub of the wheel, connecting all of the spokes so that they're all connected to one another because they're connected through the hub, that the Pope becomes that important visible sign of unity for the church. And without it, you have these kinds of disputes. So it's interesting, though, what's going on with the patriarchs of Moscow and Constantinople. Like, we look at the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Russia says this, these regions in Ukraine and Ukraine itself, we're liberating them. This is actually a part of Russia. You should be back with us. And Ukraine would say, nope, we're an independent country. We're not under you. And so there's kind of a parallel of that between the patriarchs of Constantinople, Patriarch Bartholomew of Constantinople, and Patriarch Kirill of Moscow, saying, well, who is, and I forget which one it is, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church or the Orthodox Church of Ukraine?
Yeah, there's several actually. So you have the Orthodox Church of Ukraine that is under Metropolitan Epiphanius that Moscow does not recognize.
Okay.
You also have the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate that is under Russia, under Moscow.
Right.
And that's at the heart of the dispute.
Yeah. So the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, so it's like, well, which patriarch are they under? It's just like we have a conflict now over which civil leader are you supposed to be under. We actually, like, part of it is also, well, what religious leader are you supposed to be under? Is the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, is it supposed to be under the Patriarch of Moscow, Kirill, or under the Archbishop of Constantinople? Because Patriarch Kirill has said a lot of things to be, very supportive of Putin and what he is doing with the invasion, which also throws a wrench in discussions about who, because even if the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and I apologize if I'm referencing the wrong one, people know what I'm talking about, if that church is canonically whatever's supposed to be under Moscow, it gets even worse seeing how Kirill is in with Putin politically with everything. So this is all kind of tied together, basically, right?
Yeah, and some have, rightly noted that, well, if he is their spiritual father, that is the people of Ukraine, there's some problems there, of course, with his association now with Putin. But yeah, at the heart of this controversy is, as you're noting here, really who is over the church in Ukraine. So, and it again goes back to this issue of autocephaly. The ability to be not only self-governed, but to appoint your own head. Well, long story short, you can see that even with a spokesman for the Russian church, Metropolitan Hilarion, saying that from Russia's perspective, Moscow has been given the ability to be the head effectively of the Ukrainians. So it is really up to them as the mother church to determine whether or not autocephaly would be granted to the Ukrainians, and that this power, this authority, if you will, as the mother church over the Ukrainians, was granted to them by the Patriarch of Constantinople over 300 years ago. They want to say that, a very long time ago, Constantinople used to be the mother church of Ukraine, but that was then given over to Russia. But here now Constantinople is coming back and saying, oh, well, actually, I'm the spiritual leader. I'm the mother church, if you will, of the Ukrainians. And therefore, I have the ability to grant autocephaly. Now, that's Russia's perspective, right? Constantinople is going to say that it only, at best, it only temporarily gave this authority to Russia as the mother church, but it's still actually the mother church. And in fact, the very document that granted the Ukrainians autocephaly notes that Constantinople, at least Bartholomew claims there, that they're his daughter church. So he's their spiritual parent, if you will. So that's where the dispute is. So, who actually has the authority to grant autocephaly, who's their mother church? That's the heart of it.
And so you think that would you say that the decentralization of Eastern Orthodoxy over the past nearly 1,000 years, that it has continued to result in decisions and stalemates and things like this over time? Because it's difficult. People will say like, oh, I don't want the liabilities that come with the Pope, and the authority he has is different from every other patriarch or anyone else like that. But at the same time, it seems like without that, Eastern Orthodoxy it's kind of been stuck for like 1,000 years. Like I think you mentioned in your article that they've tried to host things like ecumenical councils to resolve who determines autocephaly, and nothing can just ever get resolved.
Right. And back when they had an emperor, that helped a little bit to
Right.
replace the papacy. That helped to bring about some unity. But now that that is gone,
You mean like
um,
the Byzantine
the
Empire?
Byzantine
Yeah.
Empire, yeah,
Yeah.
which then also some believe was transferred over to Moscow as the Third Rome. But we'll table that one for now. But back in the day when they had a recognized emperor in the Byzantine Empire, it was a little bit easier to keep them unified, although they still had a lot of problems then. But without an emperor, it's been very difficult. Now, to their credit, they have been able to resolve some disputes. You mentioned Rokor. There was a period where Rokor was not in communion with Russia,
Yeah.
and then they entered back into communion. There was a dispute between Constantinople and Moscow not too long ago over the Church of Estonia, and they were able to resolve that. But these are temporary patches, if you will.
Hmm.
They're not going to ultimately solve their problems because, as you just noted there, effectively, we're going to have some kind of pan-Orthodox synod or ecumenical council to resolve these things permanently. But that's the problem. That's the difficulty is having a pan-Orthodox synod, having something like an ecumenical council. Who gets to call it? Who gets to vote? Who participates? How do you know whether or not something is passed? Is it unanimous? Is it majority vote? Russia's perspective is for a pan-Orthodox synod to be binding, for example, they think that every Orthodox church has to participate. So if any of them back out, which they did in 2016 for a pan-Orthodox synod that had been in preparation for over 100 years, if any Orthodox church backs out, oh, well, there it is. It's no longer binding. Well, with that kind of standard of authority, I'm not sure anything will ever be resolved.
Right.
Perfect unanimity. I mean, that's a pretty high standard. So
Yeah.
that's why we have these difficulties to this day in Orthodoxy, unfortunately.
Catholics who, because you spoke about this, I think, on Catholic Answers recently, about Catholics who've been, disenchanted with some of the changes that have happened to the church. You have the motu proprio in the Latin Mass. You've had confusion in magisterial teachings recently. And then some people look, and then, you have things, the clerics, bishops, archbishops in the West, some of them saying and doing pretty dopey things. Like, well, one, this is interesting. This idea, they just kowtow to the government during the pandemic. And some bishops did do that. And others fought as hard as they could to provide the sacraments. And it's hard if you see like your bishop like in cahoots with the government and you think, I don't want to have anything to do with this. And you see Orthodoxy and think, look at this untouched, beautiful liturgy, doesn't care what the government thinks, blah, blah, blah. And that might be true for many Orthodox churches here in the United States. They don't care, But then you go, what's interesting, number one, that there were Eastern Orthodox patriarchs and clerics who were very strong for lockdowns and for COVID vaccines and things like that, who did things that even those same traditionalist Catholics wouldn't like. And then number two, if you don't like it, they're just kowtowing to the government. Well, look what's happening with the Russian Orthodox Church and Putin with this invasion and everything that's happening. They're completely lockstep with it. So I think it's important, to point that out, to say, look, grass is not greener on the other side. But also, my big temptation to tell Catholics, don't you for a second try to gloat about where, you see some Orthodox clerics saying, or patriarchs saying dopey things. We got more than our fair share of it. So it's like kind of like a wire we got to walk.
More than our fair share. And how is it that, some of their clerics, I should say, going astray from Orthodoxy? How does that help us really when it comes to reconciliation? It doesn't. It just makes it that much harder. So you're right. We definitely shouldn't gloat, and we definitely have a lot of problems on our end, as you note there. And I would also say I know a handful of Orthodox here in the United States that actually had to change their jurisdictions because they felt very betrayed by their bishops, Orthodox bishops in the United States, who cooperated with the government over the lockdowns. Whether they're right or wrong is another issue. The point is they felt that they were wrong. They felt betrayed. They felt they didn't have access to the sacraments. Therefore, they switched jurisdictions. So that same problem exists in Eastern Orthodoxy, even here in the United States.
Yeah, so I think that that's an important point to bring up. And definitely people are listening, go check out Catholic.com. Michael had a great appearance. I forget if it was Focus or Catholic Answers Live, but I think you talked about Orthodoxy a little bit.
Yeah, that one was on the Focus one. And then I
Focus,
also
yes.
did a Catholic Answers Live last night talking about Eastern Christianity. So
Oh,
there's
good.
another supplement one. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that's important just to point out because it's easy to think, oh, because that's always what happens to people who leave the church, whether it's Eastern Orthodoxy or the evangelical Bible study that's super friendly and everyone's really charismatic. Like it's kind of interesting, right? It's sort of like when people are tempted. It's not obviously the same in every respect, but it's like when people are tempted to infidelity. It's like you imagine how great it would be to have this relationship with this other person instead of your spouse, and you can't see any of the downsides that just show up in marriage. And much the same way, I think it happen is that you can look at other religions, other Christian denomination, other churches like the Orthodox, or other ecclesial denominations, Protestants, or even other religions, and you only see the grass is greener, and you don't see, look, the perennial problems of sin, of corruption. You'll find that everywhere. But which is the church Christ established that has the remedy for these kind of things? So I don't know if that makes sense.
You hit the head on the nail. That's the question. Not what do I like? What are my preferences? What are my experiences? One could have a great experience in the Catholic Church, and that doesn't necessarily mean that Catholicism is true. One could have a great experience in Orthodoxy. That doesn't necessarily mean that Orthodoxy is the fullness of the faith. In order to really determine these things, we have to go to objective truth claims. So we really have to ask the question, okay, well, which is the community that Christ established? And let's trace this thing out historically and doctrinally. That's really where, in my opinion, the discussion should be. But oftentimes we're hurt, we're emotional, and therefore we make decisions based on subjective feelings more than objective truth claims. And it's understandable. I think we've all experienced that before. But at the end of the day, we have to ask, no matter whether I feel good about it or not, what is the church Christ established? Where does God actually want me? And that's where I need to be, regardless of how I feel.
Michael, thank you so much for coming on the show today. I will link to your article, The War in Ukraine is Spiritual Too, published at Catholic Answers, and some of your recent appearances there. People, go and check it out. Also check out Michael's podcast, Reason and Theology. I don't know if you have any fun episodes coming up soon you want to share with us, or anything else going on that front.
Yeah, all kinds of things. In fact, y'all been having discussions about the old Earth and young Earth issue, and I'm going to have Gideon Lazar on in a few days to talk about his perspective. I differ from his perspective. I'm more along the lines of Jimmy, but I'm more than happy to have him on and here continue the discussion. So.
Oh, that's great. Well, keep it up, and definitely people are listening, go check out Reason and Theology. Awesome podcast and YouTube channel. Thank you so much, Michael, and thank you guys so much for listening. And hey, I hope that you all have a very blessed day. Hey, thanks for watching this video. If you want to help us produce more great content like this, be sure to click subscribe and go to TrentHornPodcast.com to become a premium subscriber. You'll help us create more videos like this and get access to bonus content and sneak peeks of our upcoming projects.